Hi everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, A Beginner's Guide to the Four Fields of Anthropology in celebration of World Anthropology Day 2021. My name is Kirsten Snover and I'll be your instructor. And thank you for taking the time to participate in this webinar today. So let's get the presentation loaded up. This webinar is for beginners, people who don't know anything about anthropology, or maybe just know a little bit. So if this sounds like you, then you're in the right place. The replay of today's webinar will be available on demand through a link sent to your email address in the next few days. So if you missed something today, don't worry. I'd love to hear from you during this webinar, so if you have a question, just use the chat feature. I strongly believe that there are no stupid questions, so please don't be afraid of asking a question. I will be answering the questions that were submitted ahead of time by email first, so if I don't get to your question, you can tweet me, message me on Facebook, or send me an email afterwards. I'll be posting my contact information at the end of the webinar. Here's our agenda for today's webinar. First, I'll begin with an introduction. Then, I'll be talking a little about each of the four fields of anthropology. After that, I'll let you know about the online courses I offer through Anthropology for You. And finally, I'll answer questions. And throughout the webinar, I'll be asking you to participate. So just type your replies into the chat. Okay, let's get started. Once again, my name is Kirsten and I'm an anthropologist. I have 2 master's degrees in anthropology, and you can see from the photos that I am also disabled. My first master's degree is in interdisciplinary history and anthropology from Eastern Washington University in Cheney, Washington. My second master's degree is in medical anthropology from Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio, which is one of the top 40 universities in the United States. I have also worked as a medical anthropologist for the Cleveland Clinic, the #2 hospital in the world. When people hear that I'm an anthropologist, so many tell me they wish they could study anthropology, but they don't want to have to go to college to do that. That's why I created Anthropology for You, to teach online and in-person courses in all 4 fields of anthropology. In addition to courses, I also teach webinars like this one through Anthropology for You. So that's all about me. What about you? Where are you watching this webinar from? I'm in Washington State in the USA. If you want to, go ahead and type your location into the chat. Welcome, everyone. All right, let's begin our study today with another question. What do you think anthropology is? What is your definition of anthropology? Take a minute and think about it, and then type your answer into the chat. Okay, so here's a simple definition of anthropology that is easy to remember. Anthropology is the study of people. That's it. That's what anthropology is, the study of humans. The discipline of anthropology is broken down into 4 fields: cultural anthropology, the study of human cultures around the world; physical or biological anthropology, the study of the human body; linguistic anthropology, the study of human language; and archaeology, the study of what humans left behind through excavation. So that's what anthropology is, and those are the 4 fields of anthropology. This webinar will go more in depth into each of these 4 fields, and it will include some real-world applications of each field. All right, let's begin. We'll start with the field of cultural anthropology. So, as I mentioned earlier, cultural anthropology is the study of human cultures around the world. And when anthropologists study different cultures, they study all aspects of the culture. So, cultural anthropology involves many topics. One topic is marriage. Cultural anthropology studies the different forms of marriage around the world. So, when you get married, how many husbands or wives are you expected to have? Take a minute and type your answer into the chat. Many of you might expect to have only one spouse. Well, in some cultures, like the Nuer of Sudan, a man marries 2 or more women. This is called polygamy. And in other cultures, like a culture in Tibet, a woman marries 2 or more men, which is called polyandry. And there are other options for marriage too. Another topic is gender and sexuality. Did you know that some cultures have more than 2 genders, male and female? Many cultures have 3 genders, and a culture in Indonesia even has 5 genders. Another topic is social inequality. There are 3 basic types of societies: egalitarian, ranked, and stratified. Egalitarian societies are those that have very little social inequality. In ranked societies, there's a certain number of high-ranking social positions. And stratified societies have a lot of inequality, especially when it comes to wealth and power. And there is also unequal access to resources like land, tools, and education. Another topic is food. What food is your culture known for? Or what food symbolizes your culture? Take a moment and type your answer into the chat. If you are from the United States, then you might have said pizza or maybe food from McDonald's. Another topic is families and kinship, which involves who is in your family and who you are related to. Here's an example. In the United States, people think they are related equally to their mother's family and their father's family. But in other parts of the world, things are different. For example, in some cultures, you become a member of only your father's family. So those are some examples of topics that are part of cultural anthropology. There are also many subfields of cultural anthropology. Here's a few examples. There is economic anthropology, which studies the different economic systems found around the world. There is political anthropology, which studies political systems around the world. And there is legal anthropology, which studies law in other cultures. There is also the anthropology of religion, which studies religion and culture, and includes things like sorcery and witchcraft. And there is also urban anthropology, which is the study of cities, including things like globalization. And there is the anthropology of art, which studies art and culture, including body art, like painting the body and tattoos, visual arts, like jewelry and pottery, and performance arts, like music, dance, and theater. Did you know that many cultures don't even have a word for art? This is because art is so integrated into their lives that these people don't see art as something separate. And there is visual anthropology, which involves photography, film, and video. And there is medical anthropology, which is the study of health and illness around the world. This is what I specialize in. Medical anthropology asks things like, what do people do when they get sick? Like, do they self-treat at home with over-the-counter medications? Or do they see a doctor? Or do they pray? Or what? So, those are some of the subfields of cultural anthropology. Now, I'd like to talk a little about some real-world applications of cultural anthropology. There are many ways that cultural anthropology can be applied to the real world, and here's just a few examples. Have you ever heard of Go-Gurt? Go-Gurt is yogurt in a plastic tube that you can squeeze and eat. It's an American product, but you may know what it is under a different name. Well, a cultural anthropologist's insights created Go-Gurt. An anthropologist named Susan Squires studied families and found out that mothers wanted their kids to have a healthy breakfast, but kids wanted something fun to eat. So, based on her research, General Mills created Go-Gurt. Have you ever heard of Canon computer printers? They're a famous brand in the United States. The printer on your screen isn't a Canon printer, it's another brand, but they all look very similar. Anyway, people weren't using the Canon printers, so Canon hired an anthropologist to find out why. The anthropologist studied people who bought the printers and made suggestions on how to get people to use them. And as a result of the study, Canon designed their Canon Creative software. Have you ever eaten snacks created by the Frito-Lay brand? An anthropologist, Donna Romeo, works for the PepsiCo company in the Frito-Lay department. She studies people to understand their snacking habits and what kinds of snack they want. So, those are some examples where cultural anthropology was applied to the real world. And now we've looked at the field of cultural anthropology and some of its subfields and some real-world applications. Now, let's move on to the next field of anthropology, which is physical anthropology. Physical anthropology is also known as biological anthropology. I was taught using the term physical anthropology, so that's what I use, but both terms mean the same thing. Physical anthropology is the anthropological study of the human body. This includes a study of things like genetics, anatomy, the skeleton, adaptation to diseases, adaptations to the environment, growth, nutrition, human origins and evolution, human variation, primates, and lots more. That sounds like a lot, right? But it all boils down to 4 general topics. First, genetics and evolution. Second, human adaptation and variation. Third, the primates. And fourth, the human fossil record. There are many subfields within physical anthropology, including osteology, paleoanthropology, forensic anthropology, paleopathology, bioarchaeology, molecular anthropology, nutritional anthropology, human biology, and primatology. So to explain some of these subfields, I'm going to give an example of how these subfields would be useful in studying a skeleton. So say there is a skeleton, and you need to figure out if it is human or not. Well, in order to identify it as human, you need to know a lot about the human skeleton. This is the subfield of osteology, which is the study of the skeleton. You need to know a lot about our skeleton in order to study past humans who are in fossil form and also to analyze humans who died more recently. For example, here is a human bone. Take a guess at what it is, and then go ahead and type your answer into the chat. So, this is a femur, which is the bone in the upper part of your leg. Let's try another one. Here's another bone. Take a guess at what it is and type your answers into the chat. So this is a kneecap, and the formal name for it is the patella. And let's do one more. Here's another bone. Guess what it is and type your answers into the chat. Well, this is a hard one. It looks a little like a butterfly, and it's actually one of the bones in the skull, called the sphenoid. And here's an image showing where it sits in the head. Now, let's go back to the subfields of physical anthropology. If the skeleton is an ancient human fossil, then you need the subfield of paleoanthropology, which studies human fossils and human evolution. For example, paleoanthropologists studied a skeleton named Lucy, which has been found to be 3.2 million years old. Lucy walked on two legs, but had a much smaller brain than humans, and she probably spent time both in the trees and on the ground. She is considered a transitional species between humans and earlier primates. If you determine the skeleton is a human who died more recently, then you need the subfield of forensic anthropology. This is a more well-known subfield thanks to the American TV show Bones, which featured a forensic anthropologist. Forensic anthropologists identify human remains and analyze skeletons for the police and other law enforcement agencies. One thing forensic anthropologists do is figure out if a skeleton is male or female. There are many factors involved in this, but one part of making this decision is looking at the pelvis. And on your screen are two pelvises. One is male and one is female, and there is a view from the front and also a view from the above for each one. So which one do you think is female? Here's a hint. Remember that females need to be able to push a baby through. Take a guess at which pelvis is female and type your answer into the chat. Type either 1 for pelvis number 1 or 2 for pelvis number 2. Well, if you said pelvis number 2 is female, then you are right. In the top two images, you can see an area circled in red. That area is much more open in the female and closed in the male. There is also something called the subpubic angle, which is shown in red on the bottom two images. And in females, this angle is wide, and in males, the angle is narrow. Back to the subfields again. Say you have an ancient skeleton and you want to find out how the person died or if they suffered from any diseases. Then you need the subfield of paleopathology, which is the study of disease and trauma in ancient skeletons. For example, paleopathologists studied the remains of King Tut, an ancient Egyptian pharaoh, to see why he died and what illness and trauma he had. It turns out he had a severe knee fracture and malaria, among other problems. And what if the skeleton is part of an archaeological site? Then you need the subfield of bioarchaeology, which studies human remains and their archaeological context to make interpretations about what the people ate, their health, their social status, and lots more. For example, bioarchaeologists studied a man frozen in the Alps, known as the Iceman. Analysis showed that he was 5,300 years old. He had an arrow in his left shoulder, osteoporosis, and multiple tattoos. And say there is a skeleton and you want to learn more about it genetically. Then you need the subfield of molecular anthropology, which uses genetics to study both ancient and modern populations. It uses DNA to study the evolutionary relationships between humans and other primates, and the relationships between different human populations. For example, DNA from Neanderthal skeletons has been recovered and is being analyzed by molecular anthropologists to learn more about them. So, DNA looks like a twisted ladder, and the rungs of the ladder are made up of something called nucleotide bases. There are 4 bases, A, T, C, and G. And A connects to T, and C connects to G. So, if one side of the ladder is A, then the other connecting side is T. And if one side of the ladder is C, then the other connecting side is G. So if one side of the ladder goes A, then C, then T, then the other side would be T, then G, then A. Now, say you have one side of the DNA ladder that is C, T, A. What do you think the other side would be? Go ahead and take a guess and type your answers into the chat. If you said G-A-T, then you are right. So those are some subfields of physical anthropology and how they could be used to study a skeleton. Now let's say that you want to use physical anthropology to learn more about living people. Well, there is the subfield of nutritional anthropology, which studies the relationships between food and nutrition, cultural practices, health, and disease in living people. It also looks at the relationships between culture, diet, and evolution. And then there is the subfield of human biology. Human biology studies human variation and adaptation. Here's an example. People who live at high elevations, like in Tibet and Peru, adapt to a life with less oxygen. And anthropologists specializing in human biology study how that's possible. It turns out these people have large lungs and chests and an enhanced blood circulation system. So those are some subfields of physical anthropology that study living people. And finally, the last subfield is primatology, which is the study of non-human primates, like apes, monkeys, and prosimians. Why should we study other primates? Well, anthropologists study the genetics, anatomy, physiology, and behavior of primates who are our closest living relatives to give us all a better understanding of ourselves. You may have heard of Jane Goodall, an anthropologist who studies wild chimpanzees, or Diane Fossey, who studied mountain gorillas. Did you know that mountain gorillas have families and they mourn the death of family members? They also play and tickle each other just like humans do. So I said that non-human primates include apes, monkeys, and prosimians. But can you identify each of these types of primates? Here's a primate on your screen. Would you guess ape, monkey, or prosimian? Go ahead and take a guess and type your answer into the chat. Well, if you said monkey, you are right. Here's another primate. Is it an ape, monkey, or prosimian? Type your answer into the chat. Well, if you said prosimian, you are right. Prosimians include the lemurs, lorises, bush babies, and tarsiers. This on your screen is a tarsier. Last one. Here's another primate. Is it an ape, monkey, or prosimian? Go ahead and type your answer into the chat. This was a hard one. So if you said ape, you are right. This is a chimpanzee, which is a type of ape. Apes include gorillas, bonobos, chimpanzees, orangutans, gibbons, and siamangs. So these are the subfields within the field of physical anthropology. They're all different aspects of studying the human body and human evolution. Now, I'd like to talk a little about some real-world applications of physical anthropology. The most obvious application of physical anthropology is with the subfield of forensic anthropology. Forensic anthropologists help law enforcement agencies, including the FBI and the United States Department of Defense, by identifying the skeletons of people who have recently died. For example, forensic anthropologists helped out with the identification of those killed in the 9/11 terrorist attack on the United States. Here's another example. In the United States, there is something called NAGPRA, which stands for the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. NAGPRA says that human remains of Native American ancestry must be returned to their native descendants. But how do you identify if a set of human remains are of native ancestry so that you can comply with the law? Well, you hire a physical anthropologist. Another application of physical anthropology is in anthropometry. Many industries, such as the automotive and aerospace industries, need information on the size, shape, and anatomy of the human body so they can build cars and planes or whatever. So they hire a physical anthropologist to give them this kind of information. So that's some information about the field of physical anthropology and its subfields and some real-world applications. Now I'm going to move on and talk about the field of linguistic anthropology. As I mentioned before, this is the study of human language. So I want to start off our exploration of linguistic anthropology with a little activity. First, I want everyone to go ahead and type into the chat how many sounds the letter P makes in English. Go ahead and type a number into the chat, and I'll just give everyone a moment to respond. Now, place a hand in front of your mouth and say the words pill and spill. Go ahead and try it now. What happens? Well, you should feel a little puff of air when you say pill, but not when you say spill. Go ahead and try it again and see if you can feel the puff of air in pill. If you listen carefully, you'll discover that these are two different sounds. So actually the letter P in English makes two different sounds, and perhaps you didn't know that. The study of these sounds of language is called phonology. And phonology is part of the structure of language and is something that linguistic anthropology studies. Now let's look at the other kinds of language structure. So say you have a sentence in English like the one on your screen. I walked to the store. A linguistic anthropologist would look at the meaning of the sentence and the words within it. This is called semantics. And they would look at the structure of the sentence, which is called syntax, like how it says, I walked to the store, which is in a format called subject, verb, object, instead of saying to the store I walked, which is in a format called object, subject, verb. Some languages say it in different ways. And linguistic anthropologists would also look at how words are formed, which is called morphology. So, like how the word walked is formed from the word walk and the ending ed. And a linguistic anthropologist would look at the sounds of the sentence, which I said before is called phonology, like how the word S-T-O-R-E is pronounced store, not story. The E is silent. But linguistic anthropology studies a lot more than just the structure of language. It also looks at things like the origin of language, the evolution of language, how languages are classified and related to each other, how and why languages change, including the death of languages. It also studies how people learn languages and language variation, which means varieties of a language like dialects. Also, linguistic anthropology studies the relationship between culture and language. This includes things like language and social class, language and gender, and language and ethnicity. I'll give you some examples of what I mean. So first, here's an example of language and social class. Take a look at these two sentences. Number one is, I ain't got no money. Number two is, I don't have any money. Can you tell which one is more likely to be said by a member of the American lower class rather than someone who is upper class? Take a minute and type into the chat the sentence number, either 1 or 2, that would be said by a lower class person in the United States. Okay, so if you said sentence number 1, you are right. That style of speaking is associated with being lower class in the United States. So this is an example of how language can show you what social class someone is in. Now, here's an example of language and gender. Take a look at these two sentences. Number 1 says, I think the steak is delicious, don't you? Number 2 says, that was a damn good steak. Can you tell which one is more likely to be said by an American male rather than a female? Take a minute and type into the chat the sentence number, either 1 or 2, that would be said by an American male. Okay, so if you said sentence number 2, you're right. American men are more likely to swear and more likely to use words like fine, good, or great, while American women are more likely to use words like delightful or lovely. Also, American women are more likely to say things at the end of a sentence like, isn't it? Or wasn't it? Or don't you think? Which are called tag questions. So for example, an American woman might say something like, it's a beautiful day, isn't it? And there are lots of other differences in how men and women talk, but we can't get into all of that here. So this is an example of how language can reveal a person's gender. Now I'll talk a little about the subfields of linguistic anthropology. There are 3 main subfields: descriptive linguistics, historic linguistics, and sociolinguistics. Descriptive linguistics involves describing languages and writing down spoken languages. Historic linguistics looks at things like how language changes over time. And finally, sociolinguistics studies the social and cultural context of language and looks at how language is affected by gender, class, age, and other factors. So now you know a little bit about what linguistic anthropology involves. Now I'd like to talk a little about some real-world applications. One application of linguistic anthropology is seen with language revitalization programs. Many indigenous languages around the world are endangered. These communities are at risk of losing their native language completely, since the elders are the only ones who are fluent in the language, and they don't live forever. And language is very important in culture. For example, it's often central to people's identity. So many communities have chosen to create language revitalization programs. Linguistic anthropologists can assist in the creation of these programs, and they can record the entire language so that it's all written down somewhere and preserved, and so the language cannot be lost. Another application of linguistic anthropology is with marketing. Companies need to choose brand names to market their products, and a linguistic anthropologist can help. The name of a product affects what people think about the product, so choosing the right name is important. Also, since business is international, you need to make sure that whatever you call your product does not mean something offensive in another language, or those people won't buy your product. Even if you make up a word for your product, you need to make sure the sounds mean what you want them to mean. Sounds have meanings just like words have meanings. Here's an example. So on your screen are 2 tables, a big one and a small one. And let's say that you need to give a name to each table, and your choices are mill and mall, which in English are just sounds, they're not words. Which sound would you give to the big table and which sound for the small table? Take a moment and type into the chat the sound that you would give the big table. Okay, so if you said mall for the big table and mill for the little table, you are like 80% of people in a language study. There is something about the sound mall that English speakers associate with something big, and there is something about the sound mill that is associated with something small. So this is an example of how sounds have meanings, not just words. So a linguistic anthropologist can work with marketers to decide on a business name, or to make up a name that has sounds that mean what they want to mean. So that's some information about the field of linguistic anthropology and some of the subfields and some real-world applications. So that's the end of talking about linguistics. Okay, now let's move on to the last field of anthropology, which is archaeology. As I mentioned earlier, archaeology is the study of what humans left behind through excavation, which means digging things up. The things that people left behind are called material culture. Material culture can include buildings, tools, weapons, pots, and many other things. Two kinds of material culture are artifacts and features. Artifacts are things that have been made or modified by humans and are portable, like clay pots. Features are things that have been made or modified by humans but are not portable, like a wall. So now let's see if you can tell the difference between an artifact and a feature. Here's an image of some jewelry. Is that an artifact or a feature? Take a guess and type into the chat either A for artifact or F for feature. All right, if you said artifact, you're right. Now here's an image of a path. Is that an artifact or a feature? Take a guess and type into the chat either A for artifact or F for feature. If you said feature, you're right. Archaeologists study all past cultures, including those with written history, which is called historic archaeology, and those without written history, which is called prehistoric archaeology. We only have written evidence from past societies starting from about 3000 BC, which is about 5,000 years ago. So material remains are the only source of information about people before that point. There are several specializations within archaeology. Some archaeologists focus on certain time periods, such as the Paleolithic, which is before 10,000 years ago, or maybe classical Greece. Other archaeologists focus on certain geographical areas, such as Egypt or China. Some specializations are not related to time or geography, such as environmental archaeology or underwater archaeology. Environmental archaeology studies how humans use plants and animals, while underwater archaeology focuses on material culture found underwater. Other examples of specializations include bioarchaeology, which is the study of bones and other biological remains, geoarchaeology, which is geological science applied to archaeology, and archaeogenetics, which is using molecular genetics to study the past. There is even something called experimental archaeology, where archaeologists test hypotheses by recreating things from the past. For example, some archaeologists create replicas of projectile points, what some people call arrowheads, to study how they are made and used. Archaeologists interpret the evidence they find and try to reconstruct the past. Here's an example. Say an archaeological site contained lots of bones from game animals and parts of weapons. It may be interpreted as a kill site, a place where game animals were killed. Now you try interpreting. Say you found a bunch of blackened stones placed in a circle and there is burnt material in the middle of the circle. What could this be evidence of? Take a guess and type your answer into the chat. All right, if you said something like a fire pit or a fireplace or a hearth, you would be right. So archaeologists study the things they find, and those give clues to how life was in the past. For example, archaeologists can reconstruct the environment that people lived in by looking at things like plant remains. So if you find the remains of a bunch of cactus plants, then you know the environment must have been warm and dry. Here's another example. Archaeologists can tell what people ate. One way is by looking at plant remains. For example, in a storage pit in England, they found over 60 pounds of charred plant remains, made up of barley and wheat and other things. You can also tell what people ate by looking at animal remains. For example, if there is a huge pile of empty clamshells in an archaeological site near the ocean, then you know people must have been eating them. Your turn again. Say you found some jewelry made out of seashells in an archaeological site that was very far from the ocean. What might that be evidence of? Take a guess and type your answer into the chat. All right, if you said something like, this could be evidence of people trading with other groups of people, then you are right. Now I'd like to talk about some real-world applications of archaeology. One way archaeology has been applied to the real world is seen with Native American reservation and land claims. Data from archaeology has been used to determine the reservation boundaries for Native American groups in the United States. But this is not just happening in the United States. Native people from all over the world have used archaeologists to provide evidence for their land claims. Another application of archaeology is seen with cultural tourism. Archaeological sites are a big attraction for tourists. Think of Stonehenge, Easter Island, and Machu Picchu. Knowledge from archaeology is used in developing archaeological tourist sites. Also, archaeology is used in developing the public education programs that go along with these tourist sites, like museum exhibits. Archaeology provides the information about the past and the artifacts to display in these exhibits. In addition, archaeology is applied to the real world through CRM, or Cultural Resources Management. Artifacts in archaeological sites are valuable cultural resources and are worth saving. But commercial development is ongoing, and human activities could damage the land containing these cultural resources. For example, construction projects, such as building roads and buildings, or putting in pipelines and power lines, may damage an undiscovered archaeological site. To stop this from happening, in the United States, there is something called the National Historic Preservation Act. Part of this act, called Section 106, says that if you want to build something and you have federal funding, federal licenses or permits, or it's on federal land, you must first figure out if your project will affect any archaeological sites. If it does, then you either adjust your project plans or you hire archaeologists to excavate the sites to save the cultural resources. So basically, in the United States, archaeologists are needed for construction companies to comply with the laws. So that's some information about the field of archaeology and some of the subfields and real-world applications. Well, we've covered all 4 fields of anthropology. Now I'm going to talk a little about my anthropology courses, and then I'll answer questions. So you've just learned a little about anthropology in this webinar. In case anyone is interested, you can learn more about anthropology by taking one of my Anthropology for You online courses. You don't need to know anything about anthropology in order to take these courses. They're for beginners, and I teach you everything you need to know. Just go to my website at anthropologyforyou.com to check my current offerings and sign up. And check back again after a while because I add new courses every couple of months. Now, please take a minute and think about what anthropology topics you'd like to learn about next. Then, if you want to, send your ideas through the chat and I'll be sure to consider them for future webinars and online courses. All right, now it's time for questions. Remember, I will be answering the questions that were submitted ahead of time first. So if I don't answer your question, just contact me and I'd be happy to help. You can email me at info@anthropologyforyou.com, tweet me at anthropologyforyou, or send me a Facebook or Instagram message through Anthropology for You's page. All of the info is on your screen. So the first question I was asked is, how are artists' impressions of any fossil generated and verified? For example, how does an artist understand the possible facial structure merely by looking at a fossil? All right, so this question has to do with facial reconstruction, which is when an artist looks at a skull of either a recently deceased individual or a fossil, and then reconstructs what the face looks like. But how does the artist know what the person looked like just from looking at the skull? Well, the tissues on the face are thin in some places and thick in other places. And scientists have come up with average measurements of the tissues at certain points all over the face. So you can use these average measurements to reconstruct a face. First, you create a replica of the skull so that you don't damage the original fossil, and then you try to estimate body weight and see if the person was thin or heavy or average. And in this process, you consider things like sex, muscle markings, height, and how robust the skeleton is. In general, males are heavier than females. Larger muscle markings on the bones mean a heavier weight. Thicker, more robust bones also mean a heavier weight, and taller people weigh more than shorter people. Then you take the average facial thickness measurements I mentioned earlier and either add to them if the person is heavy, or subtract from them if the person is thin, or you can just use the average measurements if the person is an average body build. Once you have determined the appropriate tissue depths, you need to attach spacers to the skull, and spacers are made of 1/8-inch wooden dowels or sometimes pencil erasers that are cut to the different tissue lengths. Then they are glued onto the cast. And then you place artificial eyes in the orbits, and then you take clay and apply it to the skull, making the thickness of the clay match the length of the spacers. Some examples of this process are on your screen. When you create the nose, you use a formula, and when you create the mouth, it's based on where the canine teeth are located. And once you've done all that, you put on the last layer of the face, which simulates the skin, and then use a formula to create the ears, and then choose a wig for hair. And the color and hair type is based on the possible ethnicity of the person. So that's how artists know what a person looks like just from looking at the skull. It's a mixture of science and formulas and art. The second question I was asked is, why are brow ridges so much a fascination? Did they serve any purpose? Okay, so brow ridges are heavy bones over your eyes, and they look like the image on the left. One reason why brow ridges are important is because archaic humans had very distinctive brow ridges. So this includes Neanderthals and Homo heidelbergensis. Over time, this disappeared though, and the forehead became more vertical. And so anthropologists want to know why these ancient humans had big brow ridges and why we don't. There's a few different theories about brow ridges. Some think that the brow ridges became smaller as the brain grew larger. But research on a 3D computer model of a fossil skull showed this probably wasn't the reason. Others think that the big brow ridges protected the face by distributing stress from the chewing muscles. But when researchers took away the ridge in a 3D computer model, it didn't affect anything. So some people think that maybe brow ridges had a social purpose, kind of like how some other primates have facial swellings that are used for social displays and signaling. Some researchers suggest that it all has to do with our eyebrows. By having a more vertical forehead, you can move eyebrows in all sorts of ways and express different emotions. These facial changes happened about the same time that a lot of social changes took place, like exchanging gifts and living in larger groups. So that's why brow ridges are important, and those are some ideas about their purpose. The third question I was asked is linguistic anthropology of any relevance to the study of primate fossils? I would say yes, linguistic anthropology is relevant to the study of primate fossils, and here's one example. An important topic in linguistic anthropology is when in our past language became possible. Basically, we don't know yet, but you can look at the fossils of primates to get some answers. First, we had to be physically capable of language, both with our brain and our vocal tract. I'll talk about the brain first. You can study the shape and imprint of the brain in fossil humans and compare them to other primates, and you can see things like when the neocortex part of the brain became complex, and also when certain areas of the brain involved in language began to appear. For example, the Australopithecus brain, dated up to 1.8 million years ago, looks ape-like, while the Homo habilis brain, dated to 1.8 and 2 million years ago, looks more human-like. And the presence of two key areas of the brain involved in language in the Homo habilis brain suggests they may have been capable of language 2 million years ago. Now we'll talk a little bit about the vocal tract. Our vocal cords are in a different spot in the neck compared to other primates, and the shape of our vocal tract is different as well. Also, our tongue is more flexible than other primates' tongues, and all of this makes speech possible in us humans, but not in other primates. The vocal tract is made out of muscles and cartilage, so it's not found in fossil form, but some scientists have reconstructed vocal tracts by studying the bottom of the skull and the lower jaw of fossils. The Australopithecine fossils seem to have vocal tracts that are more like apes, and Homo erectus fossils have more modern human-looking vocal tracts. And Homo sapiens fossils from 100,000 years ago show fully modern human-looking vocal tracts. But Neanderthals do not seem to have modern human-looking vocal tracts, so they might have been limited in what sounds they can make. So you can see how studying primate fossils is relevant to linguistic anthropology. By studying primate fossils, we can get information about the brain and vocal tract and try to figure out when language became possible. Well, that's all the questions I have time for today. Remember, if I didn't get to your question, just email me at anthropologyforyou.com, tweet me at anthropologyforyou, or send me a Facebook or Instagram message and I'll be happy to help you. Now it's time for this webinar to end. Thank you everyone for coming, and I hope to see you in another Anthropology for You webinar or online course sometime soon. Goodbye.